Hey, what's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thank you so much for checking into the YouTube channel. Today, we're going to have a great conversation about whether or not Reformed Baptists are Reformed. It's going to be a great conversation. Before we get into that, I'll introduce our guest here in just a moment. Did want to take a moment to welcome anybody that happens to be north of Pittsburgh to come visit our church. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA, just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church that's Reformed and believes the Bible and believes everything that it says is true, preaching Christ for the sake of the gospel in the world, please come visit us, Gospel Fellowship PCA. All right, so here's the deal. I'm with Timothy Decker today, and several months ago, I did a video about whether or not Reformed Baptists are Reformed. And I was kind of preemptively responding to an article on another pastor's blog about the same topic. And so I did a video, and I gave 5 categories, I guess we could say, by which we can determine the question of whether or not Reformed Baptists are Reformed. And I got the most wonderful and winsome and charitable response by way of email from my guest today, Timothy Decker, who is a Baptist pastor in Roanoke, Virginia. And he gave a little bit of pushback on some of the points that I made, very charitable and kind in the way he did it, though. So I thought, hey, we'll do a whole conversation on this topic. And so Timothy, thank you so much for coming today. Hey, give our viewers a little bit of background about yourself. Tell us where you're serving and what you're doing right now.
Hey, thanks, Matthew, for having me here. Let me point out too, it was just by God's providence that I happened across your video. Not to say that I wouldn't watch them, but it was just, scrolling through my YouTube feed that I came across it. So it was kind of a fun providence. But by God's grace, I've been married to my wife coming up on 17 years now. We have 4 children. I am one of the 2 elders of Trinity Reformed Baptist Church in Roanoke, Virginia. I also have the distinct pleasure of teaching at various schools and seminaries. There's a local broadly Reformed seminary here in Roanoke called the Blue Ridge Institute for Theological Education. I teach New Testament and Greek for them. I also teach adjunctly Greek for Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary and Acts and Pauline studies for IRBS Theological Seminary, which is another Reformed Baptist seminary. So I'm trying to play my hand at wear a lot of different hats. And by God's grace, I still have hair, and I still have most of my hair, and not many of them are gray either. So how that's been able to keep up, I have no idea, because I feel like I don't have time for much else than study, pray, and sermon prep, and my kids are in there somewhere.
Well, that is awesome. And I'm sure our viewers are going to delight to see your Spider-Man toys on the back of your shelf there. I have a good collection of Marvel and Spider-Man stuff myself, so I'm sure we'd have a lot to talk about off camera. But today we're going to talk about what it means to be Reformed in kind of a broad sense, with particular reference to Reformed Baptists. So let me kind of go over some of the things that I said in my previous video, and then we'll tick back through them, and I'll let you kind of respond to each one of those, and you can give some pushback in any way that you want to. So I think in my video, my main point is that the term Reformed has to mean something. And I tried to give 5 maybe pillars, we might say, of what it means to be Reformed. And so I said that to be Reformed, one would certainly, first of all, have to be creedal. And by creedal, I meant that they would adhere to the great creeds of the faith. We're talking about the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed. And so that a person would have to largely agree with Orthodox historic doctrines on the Trinity and the deity of Christ, all those things that were hashed out in the first few centuries of the faith. Secondly, that one would have to be confessional, and by that they would subscribe to one of the great historic confessions of the Protestant Reformation, such as the Westminster Confession of Faith, which we would hold as Presbyterians, the Heidelberg Catechism, the 3 Forms of Unity, the London Baptist Confession. Third, I mentioned Calvinism, which by that I mean the 5 points of tulip, the way that we Reformed people speak of soteriology, salvation. And fourth, I mentioned confessionalism, the idea that we are, Connectionalism, the idea that we are tied together by way of relationship between churches. And then finally, I mentioned covenantal theology. So, Timothy, I see that you've left your chair. He's back.
Sorry, my kids were playing wolf on me and said someone passed out. So I was flipping out thinking, what do I do?
Oh, man, sorry. So anyway, I was explaining the 5 C's that I mentioned to the viewers that maybe missed the video. A little excitement there in the Decker household. So Timothy, did I get the categories right? Did those 5 C's that I mentioned, did they capture the ethos of what it means to be reformed, or are there some other categories we need to add, or some that we need to delete?
I think we would probably be in agreement to add things like the regular principle of worship, the use of the moral law, especially the third use of the moral law, I think needs to be included in a discussion such as that. The one, if you recall in our email, that I raised the most objection was your number 4, the Connectionalism, and we can go through that. But the others, I absolutely am in agreement with, that being creedal, confessional, Calvinistic, and covenantal are a necessity to be considered reform. So certainly I would agree there.
Okay, so let's work through those just a little bit and go to creedalism. Now, I'm just kind of curious, when we Presbyterians, we talk about the creeds like the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, we sometimes even use those in the liturgy of our church worship. Would that be something that you would find in Reformed Baptist usage, or would it more be something that you would take instructive guidance from in developing your theology?
That would vary from church to church because we do hold to a Baptist ecclesiology of local autonomy. Each church and each elders are going to decide how they might incorporate those creeds. My church, for example, we have many former Roman Catholics who, just by their very nature, are very leery of anything that is, smacks of high church. So we have to be careful not to bruise their conscience or anything like that. So I've stated many times, that I hold the Apostles' Creed as, what does one need to believe in order to be considered a true Christian. My Greek class last night, actually, I was going through the Nicene Creed, and so we make use of it, but it's going to depend and vary from church to church how the creeds would be used in a liturgy of a local church.
Would there be anything in any one of the major creeds of the faith that Reformed Baptists would object to? I'm assuming that would not be the case, but would there be anything in there that doesn't tend to work in terms of your doctrinal frameworks?
Well, if anything, we would like to call out our Reformed Baptist brothers when they seem to be departing from the creeds, which it's been happening more frequently than I'd like to admit. But no, we, in fact, I might go one step further. I made a funny note here that as far as being creedal and classically Trinitarian, you might even say in terms of Reformed Baptist history that with a particular Baptist, we might have even won up to the Westminster Confession, just because our confession was drawn up in light of a Trinitarian controversy. So the reason that our confession in 1677 was put forth was because of a man who was associated with particular Baptist that was starting to promote anti-Trinitarian statements. And so we said, well, we got to respond. And so if you look at our chapter 2, paragraph 3, it's more robust than the Westminster Confession at that point, because we take Trinitarian theology very seriously.
Now, when you mentioned the Baptist confessions, I guess we're kind of sliding into the second C here of confessionalism, something a little bit more specific than a creed. The creeds tend to be shorter, they're older, they tend to focus on Trinitarian and Christological issues, whereas the confessions are much larger, robust statements that encompass a whole host of heads of various doctrines. You mentioned 1677, is that right? What's the relationship between that and the second London Baptist Confession of Faith, the 1689 Confession. Is there a direct correspondence between those two? Or are we talking about two separate documents?
It's the same document. When the Act of Toleration was, put forth in, I believe, 1688, obviously those who would not fall into that purview had to promote their confessional standards in secret. So the actual Second London Confession was published in 1677, was drawn up and edited at that point, but it wasn't until 1689 that it could be mass published and produced without fear of persecution. And so the first London Confession would go back to 1644 and 45.
Okay. Now, do all churches that consider themselves to be Reformed Baptists subscribe to the 1689 or the 1677? Or are there some Reformed Baptist churches that would call themselves Reformed that do not subscribe to the confession?
Well, that's the question, I think. I would like to say that if you are truly going to own the title Reformed Baptist, you're going to own a subscription of some kind to the Reformed Baptist Confession, which is the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. There are some who would like to own the title and go with what's known as the New Hampshire Confession or the Abstract of Principles, which is a much more condensed version of our confession. And it teaches many of the same doctrines, but obviously, as you pointed out in your video, it's a much more condensed overview. And so personally, for me, I would say if you, I got to be careful here. I have friends who hold to different views, so I don't want to step on any of their toes. But my personal opinion is the point of a confession is to publicly profess what you believe. And there is only one confession of faith that adequately represents what Reformed Baptists believe and have believed since the 1600s. So for me, to be a Reformed Baptist is absolutely to subscribe to the Second London Confession of Faith. Now, the subscription issue comes into play, of course, but which is, I think, a slightly different discussion. But so for me, those two go hand in hand. If your church is not publicly professing the Second London, then I don't know that I could give you the moniker so quickly, or I might just say Reformed-ish and Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Now let's talk a little bit about the practical uses of the confession within your churches. I'm part of the PCA, and so the Westminster Confession of Faith is kind of in our blood. We use it for a lot of things. Sometimes we'll use it as a piece of liturgy in our worship. We may have kind of a call and response type use of the confession or a piece of one of the catechisms. We think of using the catechisms in particular for the training of our children, both at home and in Sunday school. We use the confession quite a bit when we're talking about who is going to be ordained. We have our elders and deacons and pastors. We call our pastors teaching elders. We have them state what some of their exceptions are to the Westminster Confession of Faith. If they have any exceptions, they need to put those in writing to be approved by the presbytery. And then, of course, sometimes we use our confessions in extreme circumstances for a heresy trial. We would hope that would never come about. But if there is ever a trial on somebody's fidelity to the Reformed faith or Christianity in general, we would use the confessions as kind of our ruler, our measuring stick as to what is permissible to teach and what's not permissible to teach. So talk a little bit about how you actually use the confessions in your churches. For instance, do you use it for the testing and training of deacons and elders?
Absolutely. So I might even say that because for the Baptist, the modern Reformed Baptist movement that kind of bore out or began in the 1950s, it was a rediscovery of our confessional heritage. And so in my experience, Reformed Baptists make a lot of use of the confession and catechism. Now, I've tried to push my brothers to take on the Baptist catechism, which is the shorter catechism, baptized, much like the London Baptist is to the Westminster Confession, just to give us a more robust confessional standard as well. So I treat the Baptist Catechism as of similar the way that you would treat the shorter catechism and larger catechism. but yeah, we catechize our children. We sometimes will incorporate it in our various worship services. We have catechism classes for our children. We have at my church, we're not only memorizing a verse of scripture a month, but we're also memorizing a catechism a month. And so we definitely incorporate it. We actually just began starting to teach through our confession systematically at our church. And I know a lot of churches do that because for Baptists, in some ways, sadly, this is a new thing to have a historic confession that we can look to. That is a normed norm. And so it's been a blessing for the retrieval process for Baptists. And so we love our confession. Most Reformed Baptists would tell you that they use it quite often.
Now, just because we travel in different circles a little bit, this is kind of an outsider's observation to me, but it seems like the 1689 Baptist Confession is kind of on the upswing. Like there's a renewal of excitement about confessionalism. There's a renewal of talking about the 1689. It seems like there's more excitement for confessionalism in your circles than I had been aware of. Now, maybe I just was ignorant. But am I wrong about that? Is there kind of a new passion, a new heart for confessionalism within your circles?
No, I think you're absolutely right. With the whole push on theological retrieval, you look at some of the ones who are leading the way are Baptist. And so part of that theological retrieval and heritage is rediscovering our confessional heritage as well. So I'm reading Thomas Witherow's church that's being published, and Presbyterians, Irish Presbyterians in particular, have gone through their battles in the 1800s. Reformed Baptists weren't really a thing so much. So they were still using the confession, but by the 1900s, Reformed Baptists weren't a thing until about the 1960s, where the confession was retrieved. So I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are rediscovering the value of having a confession, whereas Presbyterians have grown up with it and maybe have become so accustomed to it that there's an apathy that I fear will one day happen with us as well, if we are not careful.
Yeah, maybe kind of the rejuvenation in confessionalism is part of this broader renewal of interest in Reformed theology that some have called the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. Some people don't like that title at all, but others see that, yes, there is, going back 10 to 20 years, just kind of a renewed interest in confessionalism, historic Orthodox Christianity, and especially amongst our Reformed churches in particular. So that's a pretty cool development. Now, let me ask you another question about the 1689, just because I'm not so familiar with it. Obviously, I know the Westminster better, but I do understand that the 1689, as well as the Savoy Declaration, they have historic roots that tie back to our confessional standards at Westminster. What do you know of the relationship between our two confessions, between Presbyterians and Baptists? Do you see them more as similar, or do you see them more as different, or is it just kind of like a Venn diagram with overlaps and differences besides? How do you kind of view the relationship?
Well, I think historically speaking, the London Confession would be more of the child of Savoy, the Savoy Declaration, which is a child of the Westminster. So you could say that we are the grandchildren of the Westminster Divines. And so I would say that there's more agreement between Second London and Westminster than I would say that there's difference. In fact, of the notable differences are going to be particularly where not just where I think there has been improvement, which obviously is going to be relative, but where clarification needed to be made, where stating clearly things like the active obedience of Christ as part of justification is stated more clearly and at length in our confession. The areas where we disagree would obviously be church government and modes of baptism and subjects of baptism. Beyond that, though, there is a great deal of overlap. But I think we drew more from Savoy. Most of those that influenced the particular Baptist came out of the Congregational movement. which is why so many, like in the Reformed Baptists, like to quote John Owen, because they find more in common with John Owen than they might with, another Puritan from that era.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, when the London Baptist Confession of 1689 was drafted, just to generalize here, did they have a copy of Westminster on their desk and the Savoy Declaration here as well, or were they principally working from the Savoy Declaration and modifying it as a second redrafting, so to speak?
I am not the expert in this field, so I could point you to others that have done far more work on this. My field of interest is New Testament studies. So, but not only did they have Westminster and Savoy, I think both in front of them, they had the First London Confession that they incorporated, and they have other documents. They use creedal language in places where Westminster, I don't think, did. And so they tried to show themselves to be in line with orthodoxy and in the Reformed tradition, though they may not have stated, we are Reformed. They were in that same vein. And in fact, I'll read something from our preface. It's known as To the Jurious and Impartial Reader. It says that we have no itch to clog religion with new words. So the reason that they were using Savoy and Westminster was because they didn't feel it was necessary to draw up a brand new confession. They took the greatest confessions that they had at the time and then further refined them to meet their ecclesiological needs. So I think that's a fair assessment. I don't know that I could go through and say what was on the desk of Nehemiah Cox, who was probably the main editor of our confession. We're not really given a lot of details. The minutes aren't quite the same then that they might have been for the Westminster Assembly. So we have a lot less to work with in terms of historical accuracy and knowledge.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and slide into the next one then. So if we're grading charitably here, we give a green check as far as creedalism, we give a green check as far as confessionalism goes. How about then Calvinism? I think when many people think of Calvinism, they may think of the 5 points of the tulip flower, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Of course, that's to greatly truncate John Calvin's theology. He believed a lot more than just the 5 points of tulip. But how would most Reformed Baptists square with those things? Are we all in agreement as far as those go?
I believe so. In fact, I think the error comes on the other side, that if you're a Baptist that happens to be a Calvinist, you get thrown into the category of Reformed Baptist, which I think is a specialized term and not just an adjective to describe a Calvinistic Baptist. So Reformed Baptists truly are in the same vein of their soteriology as a Presbyterian or a Continental Reformed.
Because Calvinism is such a hot topic amongst Baptists in general, not specifically Reformed Baptists who maybe have those details ironed out a little bit. But if you meet a brother on the street and he says he's Baptist and you say, hey, me too, you have to kind of, it's a little bit precarious what happens next if you introduce yourself as a Calvinistic Baptist. Do you find that there's tension or misunderstanding amongst those who would say that they're Baptist and others that would say they're Calvinistic and not Calvinistic?
Well, I don't even refer to myself as a Calvinistic Baptist. I come out with I'm a Reformed Baptist, and 99 times out of 100 people have no idea what that means. Even like a Southern Baptist or just an independent Baptist fundamentalist, they wouldn't have a clue what that means. So I'm finding myself having to explain Reformed Baptist in general than anything else. So I don't even go with the Calvinism matter. What I might say jokingly with great amount of charity to it, like a Southern Baptist who doesn't realize their own heritage, which drew from our confession in the very early days of the 1800s or the middle 1800s, the early days of the Southern Baptist Convention. They used to be Reformed Baptists in some way, shape, or form. But I joke about we are what you used to be, just minus the era of slavery, obviously.
Mhm.
So I try to connect with people historically, that they can realize we're not anything new. In fact, we are, we have rediscovered the old ways. And I try to point people, we draw our heritage from the Puritans, not Anabaptists. If people know who the Anabaptists are, we actually have quite a few versions and iterations of Anabaptists around us. And so that's another reason that we make that distinction clear, that we draw our heritage from the Puritan era, from the Puritans themselves, and not the Anabaptists, because even our confession tries to make that point that, we have a confession, so you won't confuse us with the Anabaptist. That was an aspersion, a name that was lobbed against the early Baptists unfairly, I think.
Do you think, Timothy, with today, in today's context, it's easier, maybe an easier pill to swallow, to introduce Reformed Baptists under the rubric of the five solas rather than the terms like Calvinism, which might be a little bit more controversial? Maybe Calvinism comes with a little bit too much baggage about what it is and what it is not. Is it easier to speak of the five solas, or is that something that you wouldn't use?
I wouldn't avoid them. I think, again, I'm trying to be charitable with my own tribe, quote unquote.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many of them would be able to tell you what the five solas are outside of Reformed Baptist. That's just to be honest. For most Baptists in general, their church history only goes back to Billy Graham.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to even make a connection with anything. They'll hear sola scriptura and think that's nuda scriptura, and so all we need is the Bible, no creed but Christ, and off you go. And I'd say no, that's not what we. So I might use it, but I don't know that it would be so helpful in our, at least in my neck of the woods, in terms of my Baptist compatriots who don't have much by way of church history or care about church history. And I think that's what separates Reformed Baptists, especially from all the Baptists. I mean, they're Baptists, care about church history, I know that, but Reformed Baptists make it a point to connect themselves, because we believe in covenant theology, that there is covenant history that we want to be part of.
Okay, so assuming then that we grant another green check here in this category, let's move on to the fourth, and maybe this is where in my previous video I might have given the first red X rather than the green check, and that has to do with what we would call connectionalism, or Presbyterian polity. Now, obviously, you're not Presbyterian, but there is a sense in which our churches in the Presby world, we have some sort of interconnectivity, responsibility to, accountability to other churches. In our terminology, we call a region of churches that fellowship together a presbytery, and the presbytery has the role of a court within the church. We have the local court, which is the session, the regional court, which is the presbytery, and then the greater court, which is the General Assembly. But a lot of the Presbyterian action happens at that presbytery or regional level. So, Timothy, tell us, how do Reformed Baptist churches work in terms of cooperation and accountability with one another?
Yeah, well, Matthew, I think you are absolutely right to put a red check on Reformed Baptists at that point. Now, this is actually a complex issue, and it's entering into a debate in a world that the first split, you could say, among Reformed Baptists was, how formal should our associationalism be? And that really is what caused the first split amongst, old school Reformed Baptists. And there's still differences of opinion, but there's been a renewal of local associations, networks, and whatnot. The difference being, there's still not a Presbyterian model where those group of elders don't have authority over local churches. There's no trial hearings. Our confession speaks of, if there are matters that sister churches can send members who hold communion with one another, to offer help and assistance, but every local church is autonomous to one another. And so in that way, you're right, that we don't meet that criteria. And where I push back is I don't believe that's an accurate criteria for what makes one reformed.
Okay.
And so that was my pushback, that if you go that route, then you're going to throw out the Congregationalist, the Prince of Puritans himself, John Owen, Thomas Goodwin, Puritans. To call someone a Puritan but not reformed seems like an oxymoron to me. What is the greatest Puritan work of literature? John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress was not a Presbyterian. So my pushback is, yes, you're right. We don't have a Presbyterian model of church polity in terms of multiple churches being overseen by a presbytery, but I would question if that is indeed what defines, or at least is a common denominator for what defines reformed.
All right, so maybe that's not a hallmark of what it means to be reformed. So in practice, though, it seems like church cooperation is a good thing. For instance, if we were going to send missionaries, we might need to help fund them together. If we're going to plant churches, we might agree to work together in terms of establishing a new work. What would happen in Reformed Baptist setting if there was a minister that began teaching error? How would the church correct itself if it didn't have a presbytery? So what happens in these kinds of situations where a pastor goes rogue?
Well, I remembering the illustration that you gave, and we are limited, and that is purposefully so. We think biblically so. It would be, let's just say, off the rails, denies the Trinity, goes to almost a Unitarian Universalist, at which point they're rejecting the confession. And because we don't have, the trappings, we don't have the infrastructure that an established denomination like the PCA or the PCUSA, in that model, there's a good chance that owning the title Reformed Baptist, owning the confession, won't even be a thing anymore. But if we assume that there was someone who maybe is holding a questionable view, it might be, and we've experienced something like this, where we might, because of our association, because of our fraternal friendships that we have amongst pastors, we might send them, warnings, ask them to consider these things. But the most we could do is to mark them out publicly and disown them as, being, a true church at that point, if it's truly a matter of heresy, something to that effect. So that is a difference, that we have no authority to, we don't hold the keys of the kingdom over that local church, maybe put it that way. So yeah, we would have no authority to remove them from a denomination or a presbytery or anything like that. We could not bring them up on trial. We could publicly, and as a group of sister churches, we could, all sign our names saying we publicly, denounce this church, this teaching. And because of technology being what it is, that actually has a fairly large impact. Whereas, beforehand, that would take 10 years of, snail mail to spread that news type of thing. So it's not the worst case scenario, but we also believe that that's the biblical way to do it. But obviously that's where we would disagree.
Now, is that always the case? Because I was under the assumption that there are some denominations that are Reformed Baptist that have a little bit more structure. So some might be independent congregational churches, but aren't there Reformed Baptist denominations like I've heard of one called GARB, General Association of Reformed Baptists. Do those Reformed Baptist churches have a little bit more mutual accountability, or am I thinking of the wrong?
Well, yeah, they do, but the extent of the accountability or the policing might be to simply throw them out of the formal association and to cut ties. And this would be true with, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, because any kind of formal association that Baptists participate in, it's an upside down pyramid, so to speak. It's local church are at the top. At least that's how it's supposed to be in Baptist polity. And so the extent of authority that they would hold over a church that is in error is to simply, you're no longer associated with, you're not part of us, we're writing you out of our association and any correspondence, so it's basically turning them over to Satan, so to speak. And that's about the extent of the authority, even in those kinds of matters. Say if it were a church allowing female elders or something like that, the most that they could do is call them to fix the error, and if they refuse to repent, then they would throw them or remove them from the association.
Well, Timothy, let's move on to the last one, and this was my last C here, which was covenantal theology. So do Reformed Baptist churches have a covenantal theology, or are many of them dispensational, or where do they lie on this particular topic?
If we hold to the confession, then the confession is very covenantal. Not only does our confession speak of the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, but also expressly speaks of the covenant of redemption as well. There might be some differences. There are differences between the covenant theology of the Second London versus the two administrations' view of the Westminster covenant theology. I hold to what's called 1689 federalism, which is again more of the theological retrieval that we are rediscovering now that we have access to particular Baptist writings that we never had before. We're rediscovering their covenant theology and how they use covenant theology to argue against the Pato Baptist view. And it wasn't that they denied the covenant of grace, or they started going towards dispensationalism, which hadn't been invented yet, but they used their covenant theology, building off of those like John Owen, we would say, whose work on the New Covenant and his Hebrews commentary seems to be moving that direction. What he would say about the Mosaic covenants, we start pushing back even further into the Abrahamic covenant, and that's what leads us to use covenant theology in still a reformed way, but not enter into a practice of Pato baptism.
So that seems to be the very edge of the razor blade then, where Pato baptism comes into the question. You mentioned John Owen being influential, who was a Pato Baptist, though. Would he be able to be a member of a Reformed Baptist church, or would most churches require him to be rebaptized?
I think according to our confession, he would have to be baptized. Okay. We would require him to be baptized. Our only pushback would be to take his own words and ask him to apply them in a consistent way, and we would say, you're almost there, brother. And so that would be something that we would require.
So Timothy, just open forum here. Give me any other pushback you want to, or sum it up in any way you'd like. Answer the question for us directly. Are Reformed Baptists Reformed, brother?
Well, I believe, and actually, if I could use your own words, you did mention the Second London Confession as a Reformed confession. And so if a church is subscribing to that confession, then yeah, absolutely, they are Reformed. Now, I wouldn't want to be lumped in with, the Southern Baptist president who made egregious statements on the Trinity. I wouldn't want to be associated with a non-sacramental view of the Lord's Supper or baptism. We do believe that they are sacramental. A question might arise: why did our confession use the term ordinance and not use the term sacrament? I think that's a fair question to ask. I prefer the term sacrament, honestly. But the same people who signed our confession preached and used the word sacrament. So we know the understanding is there, but why it wasn't. But the very idea of the means of grace in terms of the Lord's Supper and the presence of Christ in communion, it's in our confession and our catechism as well. So we have the same, pretty much the same view on Lord's Supper. Obviously, the baptism is going to be one. But yeah, I would say absolutely, we are Reformed in but it's all going to come down to, how do you define reformed?
Yeah.
And so I like your 4. Usually when I go through a process with a new member, we will use those types of things: creedal, confessional, covenantal, Calvinistic. I add on the commandments because we do hold to the moral law as abiding. That means all 10 commandments. And there's going to be various understandings of subscription to, especially the 4th commandment and the 2nd commandment. Those are the 2 that seem to come up the most. But we take these things very seriously, and I think I even quip with you that we use the same hymnal as you, the Trinity hymnal, Baptist edition, but it's the same one almost. And my favorite is that I came up with just as I was typing stream of conscious, that Joel Beeke's systematic theology. If I look, it's called the Reformed Systematic Theology, and who's the co-author? It's a Reformed Baptist. So if he can be an author of a Reformed systematic theology along with Joel Beeke, I'd like to say, yeah, I don't see how there's any question that Reformed confessional Baptists, I don't see how you can say that they're not Reformed. But I'll grant we're arguing over a label, and maybe there are more fruitful things to discuss.
Well, I think you just solved it right there, Timothy. If historians will look back on Beeke's commentary and say, hey man, even Joel Beeke had a Baptistic co-author. So that's it. You've solved the question right there. Well, Timothy, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Anything you want to promote? Anything you want to tell us about? Anything you want to leave us with before we sign off?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a fun conversation, and like you, I want to be charitable. Some of my favorite authors, friends are Presbyterians, and so I hold no animosity. Even if some theologians we won't name don't want to call us Reformed, I still love them and want to give them the right hand of fellowship. I mean, if you live in the Roanoke area, somewhere around there, we'd love for you to come and visit us at Trinity Reformed Baptist Church. We're actually technically in Roanoke County, but we're in Boones Mill. We have a Boones Mill address, which is kind of a midpoint between Roanoke and Rocky Mount, Virginia. I also teach at a wonderful institution located in Roanoke, but it's also, we have a campus in Lynchburg, a campus in Radford. I think we just opened something up in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's called the Blue Ridge Institute for Theological Education. You can find us at bright-va.org. That's brite-va.org. And doing some cool things there, whether it be training for the ministry, whether it be for a Presbyterian, teaching role, or something else other than that, missionary, or just you're a lay person that want to learn. We do that, and we have crazy Reformed Baptist guys that preach there. We have solid Presbyterians that preach there, and we're even trying to expand that market. We actually have a Reformed Episcopal church in Roanoke, and there's a few in Lynchburg as well. And so we'd like to see our branches of influence fan out a little bit more. And so very, very thankful to be associated with that institution here in Roanoke.
Well, that is so awesome. And brother, if you ever need a Jonathan Edwards scholar to come down there and do some classes for you, by all means, hook a brother up. I'd be glad to come down that way.
Yeah, right? I'll pass that on. That's great.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you benefited from this video. Don't forget my new book, Holy Living, Jonathan Edwards, 70 Resolutions for Living the Christian Life, is out. It's on Amazon.com, of course. I'll post a link to that book in the description of this video. Timothy, thank you so much for coming today. We love you all lots, and we will talk to you later.